Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Secure Talk. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I will be your host for this episode of Secure Talk. Today, we're going to be talking to Mr. Dan Draper, who is the CEO and founder of CipherStash, which is a data storage platform for sensitive data. We're going to talk a little bit about what CipherStash does. We're going to talk about some, why data security is even more crucial now than ever before. The importance of of developers having a good understanding of cryptography and more. But before we do that, let's welcome Dan. Dan, how are you today?
I'm great, Mark. Happy to be here.
Yeah,
how are you?
It was a better now that I figured out my my technical challenges, and as I just said, kind of off the air, that the solution was ultimately to reboot.
The age-old solution.
Age-old solution, right? And maybe I should go into IT support. I don't know.
You don't want to do that, trust me.
No. So hey, Dan, I can tell by your accent you're not from these parts. Where are you from?
Indeed, yeah, I'm an Aussie. Perhaps I should have said g'day when I joined, but it's actually not a thing I say very often. I live here in Sydney.
You're disappointing all the Americans in the audience.
Yeah.
They grew up with Crocodile Dundee,
Right, right. I mean, I have definitely met people like that here in Australia, but it's not so much in these parts. So I'm in Sydney, which is, a city of 5 million people. I grew up in a small town in the south of Australia, near the capital city called Adelaide, which probably most people have never heard of. But have also spent lots of time in the US, lived in New York for a while, spent lots of time in Silicon Valley. So home away from home, so to speak.
Awesome. Well, I've spent about 20 plus years overseas, including as far south as 4 years in Singapore. Never made it to Australia.
Oh, no.
And it's on my list. Obviously, during COVID, that was a no-fly zone Australia and New Zealand were both kind of no-fly zones for anybody from outside those areas.
Yeah, we lock things down hard.
Yeah. I just kind of a general question before we get started. Are things opening up now for you guys?
Yeah, they're starting to. I mean, life here, living here in the cities are, it's basically back to normal. My wife is a musician. She's a DJ. She plays in clubs, and she's been out playing, and the clubs have been full, and things are coming back to normal. I think it's still slightly challenging to travel internationally, but you can definitely do it now. So yeah, things are heading in the right direction finally.
I was just in LA last weekend, and I met a couple from Australia, and they were here on a business / kind of fun trip, and they said no problem for them to fly in and out. They weren't sure about non-Australian citizens, but for them it was much easier. Anyway, hey, I got to ask you another question. A lot of the technology for cybersecurity comes out of, you mentioned Silicon Valley. There's a lot of companies, startups in Israel, Eastern Europe as well. What's the scene like in Australia?
The scene in Australia right now is, I would say, it's blossoming. There's some fantastic companies. I mean, you've probably heard of some of our major success stories like Atlassian and Canva, but there's certainly a burgeoning startup scene here in Australia. In fact, a lot of the So technically, funnily enough, CipherStash is now a US headquartered company. We did what we call flipping up. So we have a US head company and an Australian subsidiary. So I've been speaking to a lot of American investors. But what I find really interesting is that so many US VCs now are focused on Australia because they see it as one of the kind of next up and coming boom markets to invest in. So there's a lot happening here. There's lots more capital than there used to be, and there's some really, really interesting businesses coming onto the scene.
Well, that's exciting for you.
Indeed.
Tell me, before we get into CipherStash in particular, I mean, everybody knows that protecting your data is important. But in my show notes here, it mentioned that you're of the belief that data security is more crucial now than ever before. Why is that?
I think we're at a time in history where we rely on technology more than we ever have. I don't know about you, Mark, but I couldn't do anything in my life without having some sort of internet connected device, whether it's a phone or a laptop. And that means that every time we interact with technology, we're storing some sort of data, not even necessarily consciously. It might be data that we don't even intend to have recorded about us. And behind every one of those systems that we interact with, there is a bit of software that a developer wrote, or a team of developers, more likely. And it's like the data that we store, the data that gets managed by these systems and ultimately the developers that build these systems, it's kind of like uranium. It's incredibly powerful when used correctly, but can be horrendously dangerous when not. And we've got to start thinking about this very, very seriously, or we're going to end up with radioactive waste everywhere, to extend the analogy.
When we definitely don't want that. No, I totally agree with you. It's funny. You can't even get your gutters cleaned without going online and ordering, and then your invoice comes through their portal, and they've captured all your information and who's actually providing their platform or servicing their platform. And you kind of have to assume that whatever you're putting out there to some degree is going to be leaked. You don't want to. I'm talking about from a consumer's point of view, right? But from a developer's point of view, you obviously you want your platform, whatever you're working on, to work effectively to meet the business requirements. But these days, you do need to be increasingly aware of security and building security into the platform, or into your DevOps. Explain to me the importance of developers having a good understanding of cryptography.
Right. This is a really interesting problem. When I started developing professionally in the early 2000s, life as a developer was really quite simple. We didn't have to think about a whole lot. Nowadays, I feel sorry for developers in some ways, because there's so many things to be aware of. You obviously have to understand product requirements and business needs. You've got to develop something that's fast, easy to use. Hopefully, you're thinking about things like accessibility, cross-platform support, and of course, at the heart of all of this is security. And security is not something that developers have, I think, historically, certainly in my experience, given a lot of thought to. It tends to be this pushback from security teams or auditors and so forth, saying, hey team, we've got to fix this problem. This is not very secure. And developers kind of groan and roll their eyes and say, okay, right, yep, well, that means we're going to have to delay the release by a month or whatever to fix these issues. And I think this dichotomy is a real challenge for our industry. Now, you mentioned cryptography. Cryptography is one of the best ways, if not arguably the best way, to deal with data security in an application. And I think one of the ways in which this challenge between software engineers and security teams plays out is in the use of cryptography. And what makes that so difficult, I think, is that cryptography it's a very subtle science. It's the kind of thing that it might appear that you're doing the right thing. You take a value, you've got a key, you encrypt it, and the output looks like junk. It looks like random bits and bytes, and I can't distinguish that from a readable bit of information. You go, cool, all right, that's encrypted, no worries. The problem is that experienced cryptographers or hackers know where the sharp edges are. So you might think that something's encrypted correctly, but if they see enough data that's been encrypted, they can decrypt it, or they might be able to find some trick that reveals information about the data that your average developer would never even consider.
Can you give an example of what that would actually look like?
Yeah,
because in my non-technical mind, if something's encrypted, it's locked up, man. And
right.
Unless you got these next gen computers that we're talking about, there's no way somebody's going to be able to hack that. So explain to me how that works.
Yeah, let me give you one example, and I'll give you a real world scenario. It was a company that I worked with a few years ago. I won't name names, but I was working it was an industry where there was lots of sensitive data. And one of the developers in the team had implemented a piece of cryptography. It uses a thing called a block cipher, the advanced encryption standard, and they were encrypting sensitive records with that. Now, one of the little subtleties about using the AES standard is that you must use what's called an initialization vector every time you encrypt a value. And the developer had essentially hard-coded this initialization vector. Sorry to talk a bit technically for a second, but the developer didn't realize that actually instead of hard-coding the IV, the initialization vector, should be different every single time you encrypt. Now, because it wasn't, the way that this encryption worked ended up being what's called a deterministic cipher. So that means if I take, say, your email address, I'll just use mark@example.com, and I encrypt it using a deterministic cipher, that means it's always going to be the same output ciphertext. It looks like random bytes, but it's going to be the same random bytes every time we encrypt that value. And an attacker, a clever attacker, will find the database and say, hey, these random bytes, they look like random bytes, but actually it's the same random bytes every single time when we see this record. And so then what they can do is they go to the application and they go and sign up. They sign up with your email address, and then they see that the same random bytes have now appeared in the database that they've just compromised. And wait a minute, we've seen these random bytes before. We know the random bytes that we've just signed that resulted from that sign up with this email address that we provided. So now every time we see that set of random bytes in the database, we know that that's Mark. So this is what's called a chosen plaintext attack, and it occurred in this situation with the developer that I was working with, purely because this person didn't realize that you had to have a random unique initialization vector every time you encrypted. And in this person's defense, the documentation wasn't very clear about it. Very talented developer, just didn't understand cryptography well enough to realize how utterly broken the system had now become. To the right eyes, it's not obvious to an untrained person, but for motivated attackers, that's a really good advantage for them.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I mean, that's one of the challenges that we face. That if you're a security engineer or you're responsible for security, you get these tools and you use these processes, but unless you're a deep subject matter expert, there's always a chance that you may be leaving the back door open somehow, right? Yeah, hey, I bought the latest technology, I've got it turned on, but you just never really know unless you have that deep domain expertise.
Exactly, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges for the industry as a whole, because frankly, the vast majority of folks in the industry, even experienced developers, don't understand cryptography particularly well. I think there's this sense that we sort of say, right, that's encrypted, so it's secure, right? Box checked. Now, there have been many examples throughout history, recent history, where that has actually proven to be very much not the case. And I think this comes down to it. The people that are making the libraries that use cryptography, or the systems that are made available to developers, comes down to us to make sure that it's impossible for a developer to make mistakes that they make, right? Like it's the user experience from a developer perspective. We call it the well of success. Even if you stuff up and you fall, you're kind of falling up. So it means that it's much harder for developers to make the kind of mistakes that they have done in the past.
Now, is that related to CipherStash's solution?
Indeed, it is. Yeah. I mean, our mission is to make the best possible security available to all developers using what we call searchable encryption. So there's a bit to unpack in our solution, but certainly making it very, very easy for developers to do the right thing, even if they don't fully understand what's going on under the hood, is incredibly important.
So walk me through a scenario of how a developer would use your tool.
Right. So we've developed some tools, kinds of tools that developers love to use. So we've developed a command line interface, very simple command line interface, similar to how anyone would use a traditional database. We've used a software development kit. We created an SDK for it, and have spent a lot of time researching how engineers will typically build products, and where encryption is misused in particular, but also other sort of technical mistakes that can lead to vulnerabilities, and made a library that I wouldn't go so far as saying it completely eliminates mistakes. It would be foolish of me to say that there's a perfect security model out there, but it dramatically reduces the chance of a developer making a silly mistake that they might have made with other kinds of approaches.
And does the system or the tool kind of learn from the interaction with different developers, or you kind of how do you identify common mistakes, et cetera, and kind of keep that updated?
It's not so much about learning and identifying mistakes. It's more about, so one of the things that makes CipherStash interesting is that we use what's called the disaggregated architecture. So you think about how a traditional database works. We should explain a bit more about what CipherStash really is in a moment, but you think about a traditional database. It kind of violates all of the rules that we think about as security folk. Two of the key rules that I think about when I think about secure systems is this idea of least privilege and reduced surface area. So least privilege means that no one system should provide everything, and only the people that need access to particular things should have access to what they need. So need to know basis. And yet with traditional databases, once somebody has access to your database, they essentially have access to everything. They've got keys to the kingdom. They've got access to data. There's potentially password hashes stored in those systems and so forth. And so one of the things that we've done with CipherStash is split that up. So authentication is managed by one system. Your keys, your encryption keys, are managed by a totally different system. The data is stored in another system again. And so that way, as much work and effort we put into making the libraries and the interface really, really simple and kind of easy to stuff up, hard to stuff up. Even if there was a mistake, it would be impossible for an attacker to take advantage of that because of this disaggregated architecture. Even if an attacker compromised your core data service, the CipherStash data service, they would now also need to go ahead and compromise the key management system, which is independent, and the authentication system, which is independent. So it's kind of this idea of, mitigating accidental issues is built right into the architecture, so that the ergonomics of the code base and the SDK is one part of it, but it's sort of more fundamental than that.
Yeah, so that desegregated architecture is very important, and it aligns very nicely with least privilege. And using your platform, though, what happens if a developer needs to elevate their access level? Is there an approval process, or how does that work?
So CipherStash is not opinionated about that, to be frank. So we rely on the integrations that we've built. So we talked about separating key management and separating authentication. If you're a CipherStash customer, we wouldn't manage those systems for you. So you would use something like Amazon's key management service or Azure's Key Vault, and you would manage that process independently. So whatever systems you've got as an organization to control access, you can manage yourself. And then similarly with your authentication system. So we've integrated with Auth0. We're working on an Okta integration. I know they're in the headlines at the moment. And so we encourage customers to follow best practices in that regard.
Okay, so let's go back and talk a little bit more exactly what CipherStash does. Okay, and why don't you just walk us through a couple of use cases?
Yeah, so CipherStash started really because when I was a CTO at a variety of different companies over the years, I was often asked, how do we protect data for customers? And I never felt like we had a really great answer, to be honest. And it wasn't a consequence of the company I was working in. It was a really consequence of the technology. You think about how developers store data in a database. There's really, how do you encrypt that data? How do you secure that data? And one way is to encrypt every record in the database. So if you've got a database full of records, you want to encrypt it with a key that you control. That's great for security. It's a really good way to protect the data. But it comes with a really major drawback. So I'll give you an example. We've got a patient's database with healthcare information in it. And I want to find a patient by their social security number, or I want to find all patients over the age of 40 or who have visited the practice in the last 30 days. If all those records are fully encrypted using traditional techniques, I can't perform those kinds of queries. And so the sad reality, certainly from my experience in the industry, but also through our very direct product research over the last couple of years, most organizations simply don't encrypt their databases. And that's because it takes away critical functionality. So CipherStash is the antidote to that. Because we use this technology, we call it searchable encryption. It's a technology that's been around a little while, but there's been some really interesting advances over the last couple of years that makes what we're doing possible. And so it allows you to fully encrypt your data, but also retain the ability to perform the kinds of queries that are frankly necessary to run your business. And we use this technique where the actual queries themselves are also encrypted. So CipherStash never sees any data whatsoever. We just see random bits and bytes.
Okay, but then the end user, the person doing the query, they're going to type in what they're looking for. Okay, that's going to be unencrypted but at the start, and then it's going to be encrypted as the query's fed to the database, I'm assuming. You have to walk us through that. The results, the data that's at rest and being queried is encrypted. When you pull the results out, though, then is it just it's unencrypting for that single viewer there? Explain how that's working.
Yeah, sure. So let's imagine a scenario where a user has a mobile device. So they're sitting on their iPhone and they're making queries. So to that user, this process, the encryption is completely abstract. They don't know that it's happening. But your mobile device, so there's a few different scenarios this can play out, but a common one is the iPhone in that situation. As soon as you type a query, would encrypt that query, would send the query to CipherStash. CipherStash would take the encrypted query, work its magic, so to speak. So it would perform that encrypted query using a special technique called order revealing encryption to the other data, encrypted records in the database. Would send back an encrypted response to the iPhone, and then the iPhone would decrypt that encrypted response and then show it to the user. So essentially, that means that nothing leaving the device is ever unencrypted, coming into the device as well.
Got you. Okay. And you mentioned a term that sounds fascinating. It's what did you call it?
Order revealing encryption. Yeah. So,
yes.
So this is it's a technique that was pioneered about 5 or 6 years ago. In particular, there was a paper published by two researchers at Stanford University, one of whom is actually now an advisor to our business, a gentleman called Dr. David Wu. And this paper, they called it block order revealing encryption, was essentially a new technique to provide the ability to do range queries and similar queries over encrypted data. And when I just stumbled across this paper, I was dumbstruck. I thought this was incredibly powerful technique and was surprised that no one else was using it. And what I realized is that as powerful as this technique is, it's incredibly fast, it's very secure, it's incredibly difficult to apply it to traditional databases. I can't just go and take a Microsoft SQL server, install an ORE library and hope that it's all going to work. It's much more complicated than that. And so after discovering the paper, I spent the next 3 or 4 years just working in my spare time after hours, trying to find a way to make a database based on this technology. And thankfully, in 2020, I got a working prototype. I was successful, and then CipherStash was born.
Fascinating. And I would like to learn more about how auto-revealing encryption works. I mean, because if it's encrypted, how are you able to? I just don't get it, right? So can you just give us a little bit more of a deeper understanding of how it's going to work?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of math involved, and it's a difficult concept to kind of boil down to a few sentences. In fact, one of my lead engineers said it took him about 3 months to fully understand it.
Well, we only have about another 15 minutes. So.
Yeah, I'll try to give you the 20-second version. So in a nutshell, it's using a cryptographic technique that reveals only one very particular property about 2 bits of information. So you have a query, what we call a ciphertext. Funnily enough, that's where the name CipherStash comes from. It's where you stash your ciphertexts. You have a ciphertext query, which is fully encrypted, and then you have a ciphertext record in a database. Now you want to know if that query matches that record. And actually, you don't need to reveal a lot of information or learn a lot of information in order to perform that query. You just need to know whether the query equals, or in the case of range queries, is more than or less than the record in the database. And so order revealing encryption, essentially you provide a function, a cryptographic function that reveals whether or not an encrypted query is equal to, less than, or more than an encrypted record in the database. As you can imagine, that function is highly mathematical and quite complex. So I won't try to explain it, but based on that one primitive, you can build up much more complex query structures. So you can do all kinds of interesting queries, the kinds of queries that you might be familiar with if you've developed in databases before.
Yeah, I know this is not the right analogy, but for me in my my little brain, I think of like XML tagging, for example, and if I'm looking for certain things in a database, and if it's all been tagged, I can query that. And I don't know if you can tag data that's been encrypted, if the tags show up, but what you're saying is there's a mathematical way to kind of understand what types of data that is, and then when you run the query, it's gonna pull that back through.
Right. The tagging analogy is not a bad one, to be honest. You can think of these order revealing encrypted values as kind of tags in a way. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as long as it wasn't a terrible analogy, okay, I'll go with that. So let's move on for a second. Let me ask you. I mean, why don't you tell us a little bit about what stage in the the business development cycle CipherStash is in? How is your solution being received in the market, and what does a typical engagement look like?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so we launched the business in early 2021. The old startup founder story. I quit my job and went full time on the business. We raised a reasonable amount of money last year, so we did a seed round. It was about $2.5 million seed round. We did a pre-seed as well, so it raised about $3 million all up. It's US dollars. And using that money, we've built out this platform. And actually, as it turns out, you can now go and sign up. You can go to CipherStash.com and CipherStash.com, and you can self-serve. In fact, what's interesting about CipherStash is that, we talk about developers a lot, and developers don't like cold calls. I mean, nobody really likes cold calls, let's be honest. But developers, much less than anyone else, I think, you can't apply a traditional sales model when selling to developers. And we speak to a lot of CTOs and chief information security officers and so forth, and we kind of, work through the process from that angle. But ultimately, it's developers who we want to serve, and so we've made CipherStash self-service. So you can go and sign up. You can download the SDK, set it up yourself, and start writing code using CipherStash. Within 20 minutes or so. It's very easy to get started. So we're continuing to build a product. The kinds of companies that are really interested in what we're doing range from small startups that are working in financial services, insurance tech, health tech, all the way up to large enterprise. So. And even governments, actually, we've spoken to the Australian government. We have some interesting opportunities emerging in defence, Department of Defence here in Australia, and even in the US. They're longer processes, as you might imagine, but they are particularly interested in what we have to do, what we have to offer. In terms of securing intelligence data and the like. And the needs are very different between these organizations. A small startup is concerned about compliance, dealing with compliance requirements. They are concerned about the negative effects or impacts on their business of a data breach. They want to try and mitigate that. Governments and big corporates have very different needs, as you might imagine. But at the heart of everything is this idea that data is significantly better protected. And so that's why they're all equally interested in CipherStash.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a better way to secure data, I'm sure you'll have plenty of interest. What's your biggest challenge as a startup in the security space?
I think one of the there are many challenges, of course, but probably one of the notable ones is that technology is complex. I know that sounds like such a trope. I mean, we struggled with getting a video call working this morning, but what I mean by that is that you go into an organization and you want to apply techniques like the ones we use at CipherStash, and every organization is different. There's different languages, there's different database technologies, there's different deployment architectures, there's different clouds, and trying to find a set of tools that can kind of universally fit into those all those myriad environments is very challenging. And so, frankly, we're not trying to do all of that right now. We're focused on some very specific technology stacks and use cases. So we're very focused on the Amazon Web Services. We do plan on moving into Azure, but frankly, we haven't had a huge demand for Azure so far. Focused on some of the more contemporary, developer languages like TypeScript, JavaScript, Ruby, those kinds of things. But we also have had requests to make a Java client, so we'll do that. So just, I guess, following the opportunities, identifying the technology that those opportunities implement, and then doing our best to support those particular technologies. We can't support everything, and perhaps never will. So that certainly is a challenge.
It makes a lot of sense. I've worked with a few startups myself, and one of the biggest challenges is sometimes having to say no to a potential customer. Just say,
Right.
We'd love to help you, but we really need to focus on our core right now, and our core right now is A. And if we get pulled over to B, we're going to fail at both. So, but it's tough when because you want those. It's not just the revenues. You want those reference customers. You want to get that visibility out in the marketplace, but sometimes you have to stick to your guns.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to repeatability in many ways. If you're going to build a system or build some customizations for a customer, if you don't have another, 5 or 6 customers kind of waiting in the wings with those same challenges, then you really have to ask yourself whether that's something you should do, at least right now.
Exactly. Hey, Dan, I got to ask you, I know that you're also active in terms of, promoting diversity in the IT space. You are the executive producer of a film called Debugging Diversity that explores why there are so few women in technology. And can we just talk a few minutes about that?
Certainly, yeah. So debugging diversity, it's an interesting one. You probably wouldn't expect not only a startup CEO, but also a white straight guy to make a show about diversity in tech. But I realized a number of years ago that we're trying to encourage more women to come into the technology industry. We're trying to better support women and minorities in the technology industry, and yet in many ways it's sort of been left up to them to solve the problem themselves, and yet they are not the ones that kind of currently lead the industry. So I saw myself. Go ahead. Sorry.
Can we? Yeah, apologies for cutting you off. I'd just like to get your point of view, because there's this kind of tension between diversity, and we have equal representation in a particular field, but obviously there are some fields that are dominated by women, some fields that are dominated by men, etc. Why don't we just level set? Why do you believe that diversity is important? It sounds like a no-brainer. Of course we need diversity. It should be fair access. But really, I mean, because it's all, at the end of the day, it's about business. It's not about diversity. At least if you're a pure capitalist, right? You're running a company. It would be nice if more companies had, the CSR at the forefront versus just profits. But just let's go back to this. In your opinion, why is diversity important in the context of information technology?
Quite simply because diverse teams perform better. You actually, you mentioned a moment ago, profits or diversity, which do we choose? Well, I argue that the two go hand in hand. In fact, there's been lots of research. There's a book called The Difference. The author, whose name escapes me right now, but I interviewed him in the show, talks about the research that he did, and there's lots of other research like it, that shows that when you have diverse teams, you actually get better outcomes for the company. And better outcomes can mean higher quality products, more sales, clearer marketing campaigns, and ultimately more profit. And the reason that is true, particularly in the technology industry, you think about the users of technology. Everybody uses technology, like we said before. If the people who are creating the technology are only represented by one particular group, how can we expect those people to fully represent the needs, thoughts, feelings of the people that they serve? And a classic example, I'm an Apple fanboy, so I hate to hate on Apple, but there was a scenario.
That, by the way, that was the device that I had to reboot earlier. So
Oh, right. Okay.
my MacBook Pro failed me big time today, but go ahead. Hate on Apple for a little bit. I'm in the mood.
When Apple released the watch, the Apple Watch, there are lots of features. It ended up becoming a real health device, right? It can track your steps, can track your heart rate, and so forth. And there was one thing that was missing from that watch that, frankly, I didn't notice. It didn't occur to me that it was missing, but it was affecting roughly half of the world population. It didn't have female cycle tracking. And you ask yourself, well, why did it not have female cycle tracking? Well, it was made by a virtually all male team. And men don't get periods, so it's not something that ever occurred to any of the men on the team. And then, I think it was Series 4 or Series 5, I forget which of the watches finally came with cycle tracking. And I remember my wife saying to me, "Oh, finally! I can't believe it's taken them so long to get this." And it was something that she uses obviously once a month. And I thought that was a fascinating kind of example of where
it's a very
team reflects the product.
Yeah, it's a very clear example. It just totally drives your point home. So you're coming at this from a point of view of, look, it's just going to help us to be more effective. It's not necessarily the social justice side. I'm sure that's part of it. I mean, we want to make sure that doors are open for everybody in all walks and every field potential that they want to go into. But let me ask you this: when you produced this your movie, Debugging Diversity, what did you find? What are we don't have all day here, but what are the main reasons or that we don't have more women in technology? And what are some best ideas or best practices for making technology more inclusive?
Yeah, you're asking the tough questions here today, Mark. So I think
you made the film, man.
No. I mean, let's start with why there aren't that many women in technology. I mean, there are some. It's roughly 25% of the technology workforce in the US is a woman, and those numbers are similar in Australia, and I think they're pretty similar in many parts of the world. And it actually used to be a lot higher. It was closer to 30 to 40% in the 80s. Now, opinions on exactly why we saw a decline are divided, but there's been quite a lot of studies and quite a lot of research on it. And some of the interesting reasons and some of the things that we explore in the show are it sounds like a trope when I say this, but I mean it in all seriousness. The effect of Hollywood is not to be discounted. You go and look at the movies from the 80s and 90s that included some sort of technology. Revenge of the Nerds, War Games, there's a long list. Weird Science. I don't know if you've watched any of those movies recently, Mark. I hadn't until I started doing this research, but they're really very unpleasant to watch, looking at it through with a modern viewpoint. And that's because there's these nerd stereotypes that people that use computers are kind of social outcasts and mistreated. And
yeah, I'm thinking of Michael Anthony Hall with the bra on his head in Weird Science.
Right. Yeah, it's all that kind of stuff. And so you think about the popular perception of computer scientists and software engineers. This is where the nerd stereotype came from. Mm-hmm. And you then fast forward and look at how many people entered computer science degrees or other vocational training around technology, and it was almost entirely men. But even then, it's a small subset of men, the kinds of men that kind of identify themselves as the nerd or coder stereotype. Now, to me, nerd is a great thing. I love being a nerd. I'm proud of being a nerd, and I think we should celebrate nerds. But the old stereotypes have had a really strong negative impact on how people perceive themselves, and how in particular women perceive themselves, and whether or not they see themselves as being a coder or a software engineer. And then I think the other part of it is, particularly in more recent times, most people don't have a good appreciation of what technology or coding actually is. And the classic example is using a device, like a mobile device or a tablet. Phones and tablets are content consumption devices. They're not content creation devices, at least not in the sense that you can create it with software or code. Admittedly, they are becoming more content creation devices, and if you look at things like TikTok and so forth. But you can't write a bit of code on your device. And so there's an accessibility component to this as well. Like, how accessible is the ability to write a piece of software, or even at the very least to understand what is software? How is this concept of coding connected to the device that I use and the things that I use technology to do every day? I think our education system has a lot to answer for in that regard. I never learned coding at school. I learned it because my friend his dad gave him a book on coding, and this is in the mid-90s, and I started experimenting and tinkering. If I'd never met him, I would never have had that experience. And I think that our education system needs to start exposing kids to it much, much earlier. And I say our, I mean US, Australia, UK, everywhere, right? And importantly, the education system needs to start showing not just what coding is, but how powerful it can be. It goes back to what we were talking about before, where the entire world runs on technology. How is coding connected to that? How would having the skill of coding allow me to contribute to the creation of that world? I don't think we do a very good job of that, and that means that fewer people explore technology as a career, and in particular, those that are not necessarily exposed to it through other channels, like many of us, dare I say it, white men have had access.
Makes a lot of sense. And I, again, having lived overseas for 20 years, I think, yeah, in the U.S. you can say white men, but if you've been to India, it's race has nothing to do with it. If you've been to China, race has nothing to do with it in the context of those local cultures and markets, right?
No, that's true. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
But I get what you're saying. Let me ask you this: do you see any countries doing a better job than others at this point? Like, is there a Scandinavian country, for example, that 50% of the people in tech are women, or anything even close to that anywhere?
Frankly, not really. Some countries do a little better than others, but there's certainly no one that's doing 50-50. I think you mentioned India. India probably is doing a lot better than say the US in terms of let's just look at it through one lens. That's the female representation in the workforce. And I think the reason that India does a little better on that front is perhaps they don't have the same stereotypes embedded into their culture that say that the US does. So there's maybe less of a stigma for a woman to go into technology. I think in Indian society that you tend to look at somebody as going into a highly lucrative or rewarding career like law or medicine or now software engineering as being a wonderful thing, regardless of your gender or your creed. But still, there are still big challenges, and those challenges come from other parts of the problem that we haven't talked about yet. It's a deep and complex set of challenges here. But things like sexism at work, women's safety. I did actually interview a woman who works for a big tech company in the US. And she said that there was a very strong culture or an expectation really for her to work late. She called it pushing back. So she would, she'd work until 9, 10, 11 at night. And her challenge was that she never felt physically safe leaving the office that late at night. So she would have to get a cab. or she would leave earlier. And then, of course, when she left earlier, she would kind of miss out on a lot of the other opportunities that some of her male colleagues had. So, there's all those kinds of problems as well. Certainly India does better, but it's not without challenges. So yeah, it's a really complicated problem, and I don't think any organization or any country has really nailed this yet.
Well, hats off to you for exploring it at a much deeper level than most people. And this is a process, and everybody's trying to learn. And I know friends of mine I have 3 sons, but I have friends that have daughters, and they're all very, very passionate and concerned about access in whatever field that their daughters want to go into. But obviously IT is top of mind these days for many, many people. I live in the Seattle area, so Seattle area, Silicon Valley, that area, it's hugely important. And just my 2 cents worth, one of the biggest challenges is, 80% of the STEM graduates in the US are men, and so
right.
How can you hire a higher percentage than that if you just don't have the graduate pool? So it's like you said, it probably has to start much earlier on, and that, regardless of where you're at, your sex, your race, whatever, you have access to technology and understanding of what it actually is and how it works from a very young age, So I totally with you on that. Well, hey, Dan, I really appreciate your time and your patience with me on the technical difficulties earlier. CipherStash sounds like you're in a very high potential space, because like you said, everybody cares about protecting their data, and it's becoming increasingly important. Obviously there's much more data, and so you're in a very good space. If I think you already gave us your website URL, but if people want to reach out to you or they want to get more information, do you have any suggestions? Or
Yeah, I'm happy to share my email address, so people can email me at dan@cipherstash.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. So my Twitter handle is @Daniel Draper, or you can follow CipherStash on Twitter as well, of course, @CipherStash. And of course, you can visit cipherstash.com if you want to learn more about what we're doing.
Awesome. And if somebody wants to watch Debugging Diversity, where's the best place to do that?
They can go straight to debuggingdiversity.com.
Simple enough. I'm going to put all of those URLs, etc., into the show notes. Dan, I really enjoyed this. Wish you and your team a great remainder of 2022.
Thanks so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed the chat.
Hello, welcome to Secure Talk, your trusted source of information on the latest threats, trends, tools, and technology related to cybersecurity and compliance.